My name is Margaret Cole, and I never thought I would live to hear my own children tell me that my life was no longer mine to lead. It was a gray Sunday afternoon, the kind of day when the air feels heavy, even inside the house. My living room smelled faintly of coffee and lemon polish, the scent I'd used on the wooden table since my husband was alive. That table had seen everything: birthday cakes, report cards, arguments over curfews. But on that day, it became the stage for something I never expected: my children deciding my future without me. Laura, my eldest, sat the closest. She leaned forward, her hands neatly folded as if she were about to deliver a sermon. "We'll decide what's best for you," she said softly, but with a certainty that cut through the air like a blade. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. I looked from her face to Peter's and then to Michael's, waiting for someone to smile, to tell me it was a poor choice of words. But they didn't. They nodded. They actually nodded, as though my years of sacrifice and strength had been erased by the number written on my birth certificate. I pressed my palm hard into the arm of my chair, steadying the tremor that wanted to betray me. This was the same chair where I once nursed their fevers, soothed their nightmares, and held them after broken hearts. Now, in that very place, they sat across from me like strangers, convinced they knew what I needed better than I did. A heat rose in me, sharp and unfamiliar. I wanted to remind them of everything I had carried for them: the mortgage I covered when Peter's business failed, the tuition bills I paid for Laura's children, the endless nights I sat awake at the hospital with Michael. But the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I listened as they spoke about nursing homes and safety, about finances and responsibility, as though my existence had become a problem they were obligated to solve. The afternoon light shifted, catching the lines in my hands. I stared at them, those creases etched by decades of labor and love, wondering how they could look at me and see only fragility. They talked, and I listened. But inside me something stirred. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't defiance for its own sake. It was something quieter, steadier, a refusal to surrender the last thing I truly owned, my right to choose. When Laura finished, there was silence, thick and awkward. I lifted my eyes and saw 3 faces I loved more than anything. Faces that had once looked to me for guidance. In that silence, I realized they no longer saw me as their mother. They saw me as an obligation. And in that moment, I knew one thing with startling clarity: if they believed they could decide my life for me, they were about to learn how wrong they were. When the conversation ended, I didn't slam the door or raise my voice. I simply picked up my coat, nodded as though their decision had been sealed, and walked outside. The chill in the air hit me harder than expected, and as I slid behind the wheel of my car, my hands trembled on the steering wheel. For a few long seconds, I couldn't even turn the key. I sat there in silence, the weight of their words pressing down, the echo of "We'll decide what's best for you" bouncing inside my skull like a cruel refrain. The drive home was short, but every turn of the road seemed to stretch longer than usual. The maple trees lining the street were shedding their leaves, scattering them across the asphalt in waves of orange and gold. I used to love autumn. My husband, Charles. And I would rake piles for the children to leap into, their laughter filling the air. Now those leaves only reminded me of time passing, of how quickly a strong branch can be mistaken for something brittle and disposable. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat a moment longer before getting out. The house looked the same as it always had: white shutters, a porch I painted myself after Charles passed, the hydrangeas still blooming stubbornly by the steps. But for the first time, I saw it the way my children must see it: a piece of property, an asset to be liquidated, a convenience. The thought hollowed me out. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon and old wood. I dropped my keys into the dish by the door and walked straight to the kitchen drawer where I kept my old ledger. It was a thick, worn book, pages bent from years of notes. I opened it on the counter, flipping through entry after entry. Paid Peter's rent, covered Michael's hospital bill, loan to Laura, childcare. Each line told the story of a mother who never said no, a woman who stretched herself thin to hold everyone else together. I traced my finger over the ink, the numbers written in my own hand. For decades, this book had been proof of my love. Tonight it looked like proof of something else entirely, that I had let myself become the family's safety net, the fallback plan, the quiet reservoir no one bothered to ask before draining. I closed the ledger and pressed my palms against it. My chest tightened, not just with anger, but with grief. I thought of all the nights I had stayed awake balancing checkbooks, the mornings I had left early to cover an extra shift, the sacrifices that had gone unnoticed. And still, after all of that, they had the nerve to sit in my home and tell me I was incapable of deciding for myself. A storm stirred inside me. For years, I had believed silence was strength, that endurance was love. But in that moment, silence felt like surrender. If I said nothing, if I accepted their plan, then every choice I had ever made would be reduced to nothing more than preparation for the day they took control. I pushed the ledger away and stood at the sink, staring out at the backyard where the swing set still leaned against the fence. The chains were rusted, the paint chipped, but I could still hear the echoes of children's laughter. Those children had trusted me once. They had looked to me for guidance, for safety, for freedom, and now they wanted to take mine away. The thought settled deep and sharp. No more. I would not let them decide. Not this time. The years ahead of me might be fewer than those behind, but they were still mine, and if I had to fight for them, I would. The morning after that meeting, I woke with the weight of their words still heavy in my chest. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually brought me peace, but on this morning it felt oppressive, like silence had turned into an accomplice. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam curling upward. The ledger from last night lay open beside me, its inked lines cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. My children had turned love into entitlement, and I had allowed it. That thought made my stomach twist. By the second cup, I knew I couldn't simply let things rest. If I did, everything they had said yesterday would become the foundation for tomorrow. They would move me out of this house, sell it without hesitation, and call it care. No, I needed to make sure that my life, my choices, were no longer up for negotiation. That afternoon, I called an old acquaintance, a local attorney named Thomas Jennings. I hadn't spoken to him in years, not since he handled some paperwork for Charles's estate after his passing. His voice on the other end was warm but brisk, the voice of a man who understood urgency without needing to be told. I asked for an appointment, and by the following day I was sitting in his office, the faint smell of paper and leather filling the room. Thomas listened without interruption as I explained what had happened. I told him about my children's meeting, their decision to take charge, their talk of nursing homes and selling the house. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, his eyes steady on mine. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You still have every legal right to make your own decisions," he said. "If you want to protect those rights, we'll put it in writing. A revocable trust, updated will, powers of attorney, but assigned carefully. You can decide exactly who steps in and under what conditions." His words steadied me. For the first time since that Sunday, I felt like someone was handing me back the ground under my feet. We discussed the details. The trust would hold the house, my savings, everything I had built. I would remain in full control for as long as I was capable. And when the time came, the successor trustee would be someone I trusted completely. I thought of my children, of how quickly they had agreed with Laura. My heart ached even as I shook my head. Not them, I said. Not after this. Instead, I named my granddaughter, Sophie. She was only 19, just starting college, but she was the only one who had ever asked me directly what I wanted for myself. She visited not to borrow money or ask for favors, but to sit with me, to listen. She carried a gentleness that reminded me of Charles, and a spark of independence I recognized in myself. If anyone could respect my wishes, it was her. Thomas raised an eyebrow at her age, but agreed it could work, with conditions. Sophie would only act if I were truly unable, and even then, she would need guidance from a financial advisor. It was a safeguard, not a handover. That balance was exactly what I wanted. The next hour passed in a blur of papers and signatures. My hand trembled as I signed, not from weakness, but from the enormity of it. Each stroke of the pen was like drawing a line in the sand. This was my life, my home, my future. They could argue. They could protest. But they could not erase these documents. When I left his office, the autumn air felt sharper, almost cleansing. For the first time in days, I could breathe without the echo of their voices crowding my lungs. I walked to my car with the folder pressed against my chest, holding it like armor. As I turned the key in the ignition, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes looked older. Yes, but also clearer, brighter. I whispered to myself, "This is mine. It has always been mine." And for the first time since Sunday, I believed it. It didn't take long for my children to notice the shift. A week after I met with Thomas, the phone calls started. Laura's voice was the first to break through the receiver, sharp despite her attempt at calm. "Mother, why didn't you tell us you were meeting with a lawyer?" I could hear dishes clinking in the background of her kitchen, the steady hum of her organized life. I pressed the phone to my ear and answered simply, "Because it wasn't your business to know." There was silence, then a sharp breath. "We were only trying to protect you. Now you've gone and complicated everything." Complicated. That word clung to me long after she hung up. Not liberated, not safeguarded, complicated. As though my independence were a nuisance. 2 days later, Peter appeared at my front door, his expression tight. He didn't wait for an invitation before stepping inside. "Mom, what are you doing?" His voice carried that mixture of exasperation and guilt, the tone of a son convinced he knew better. "Why would you put Sophie in charge? She's a teenager, for God's sake." I stood by the counter, my ledger open in plain sight. I wanted him to see it. I tapped a page where his name was written over and over, each entry a different rescue. "Because," I said steadily, "Sophie listens. She asks before she assumes. That's more than I can say for you." His mouth opened, then closed again. For the first time, he seemed to notice the words inked in those pages. He didn't argue further, but the look in his eyes carried a mix of betrayal and confusion, as if he were realizing that the woman standing before him was not the pliant mother he expected. Still, their persistence didn't end. Letters came in the mail, handwritten appeals, apologies wrapped in persuasion, calls from Michael late at night, his voice softened with guilt but heavy with insistence. They tried every angle, love, obligation, fear, but none of it reached me. I had made my choice, and yet doubt still crept in. Was I being stubborn? Foolish? Could they be right that I was blind to my own decline? That question gnawed at me until I decided to face it directly. One Thursday afternoon, I drove across town to visit the very nursing home they had suggested. The building stood tall and immaculate, its windows polished, its hallways smelling faintly of disinfectant and roses. A cheerful receptionist guided me through. The rooms were tidy, the residents well cared for. No one was cruel, no one was unkind. But as I walked those halls, I felt invisible. The women knitting in the lounge barely looked up when I passed. The men sitting by the window stared out at nothing in particular. A television blared with canned laughter, filling the silence with something that only made the quiet more unbearable. Everything was clean, efficient, and utterly hollow. I stood in the middle of that corridor and imagined myself there, my days parceled into meal schedules, my choices reduced to chicken or fish. My chest tightened. It wasn't fear of dying that unsettled me. It was the thought of living without meaning, without ownership of even the smallest decision. I thanked the receptionist politely and left. Outside, the air hit me with a rush of clarity. Whatever my children believed, this place was not where I belonged. Driving home, I gripped the wheel firmly, the doubt evaporating with each mile. I was not being stubborn. I was not blind. I was awake, more awake than I had been in years. And if my children couldn't see that yet, they would. When I pulled into my driveway after leaving the nursing home, the late afternoon sun had already begun to sink, washing the house in a pale gold light. I sat in the car for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, my heart still pounding with the echo of those empty hallways. If my children believed that was safety, then they had forgotten what life truly meant. That night, I couldn't sleep. I moved from my bed to the kitchen table, the same table where they had once spread out school projects and argued over who got the last slice of pie. A lamp cast a small circle of light, and in that glow I pulled a sheet of stationery from the drawer. My hand hesitated over the blank page, but only for a moment. Then the words came, steady and sure. I wrote not as their mother, not as the woman who had bent and sacrificed, but as myself. I told them clearly, from this day forward, my choices will be mine alone. You are welcome in my life as children, as family, as people I love, but not as managers, not as wardens. My home is not yours to sell. My days are not yours to schedule. If you want to help me, you will ask. If you cannot accept that, then you will keep your distance. When the ink dried, I folded the letter into 3 envelopes, each addressed in my own hand. The following morning, I slipped them into the mailbox at the end of the street. As the flag went up, a wave of release washed over me. For once, I was not waiting for permission. The response came quickly. Laura arrived first, walking up the steps without her usual air of command. She stood on the porch, empty-handed, no folders or papers clutched to her chest. Her voice, when she spoke, was softer than I had heard in years. "Mom," she said, "I didn't come to argue. I came to apologize." I studied her face, the same face I had kissed goodnight 1,000 times, now lined with worry. For a moment I saw not the woman who tried to dictate my future, but the little girl who once slipped her hand into mine when she was afraid of thunderstorms. "I forgot," she whispered, eyes glistening, "that you're still my mother. I treated you like a child because I was afraid of losing you, afraid of being left to make decisions after it's too late. I'm sorry." The anger I had carried loosened, just enough to breathe. "Thank you," I said simply. That was all. It was enough. A few days later, Peter came. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he sank into the chair on the porch beside me, his shoulders heavy. We sat in silence, the sound of crickets rising around us. "Finally," he murmured. "I didn't realize how much you've done for us. Seeing that ledger, it opened my eyes. I should have remembered sooner." He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't try to bargain. He just sat there, his presence quiet but genuine, as if acknowledging me without words. "Michael hasn't come yet, but I'm not rushing him. Change takes time. And for once, time feels like it belongs to me." That evening, as I closed the front door after Peter left, I felt something shift inside me. The battle wasn't over, not completely, but the tide had turned. My children had begun to see me again, not as a burden, not as a project, but as their mother, and I had proven to myself that my voice still mattered. The house was quiet again, but the silence no longer pressed on me the way it had before. It felt lighter, as if the air itself had exhaled. For days, I carried the memory of Laura's apology and Peter's quiet presence like small treasures tucked in my pocket. They weren't perfect. They weren't absolutes. But they were signs that maybe, just maybe, my children had begun to see me with clearer eyes. One evening, as the sun slid low and painted the sky in streaks of orange and violet, I pulled the old ledger from the kitchen drawer one last time. Its cover was frayed, its pages swollen from years of use. I flipped through the entries, loans, bills, sacrifices written in neat rows of numbers and names. Each line felt like a scar carved into paper, evidence of how often I had bled for them without asking for anything in return. I carried the book out to the porch, where the breeze carried the smell of lilacs from the bushes Charles and I had planted decades ago. I set a metal bowl on the table, struck a match, and touched the flame to the corner of the first page. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the fire caught. Curling the edges, blackening the ink, the flames spread quickly, devouring years of obligation and unspoken resentment. I watched the smoke rise into the evening air, carrying away the weight I had shouldered for too long. My chest loosened with every page that turned to ash. This wasn't anger, and it wasn't revenge. It was release. When the last ember dimmed, I tipped the bowl and scattered the ashes into the yard. The wind lifted them, tossing fragments into the fading light until they disappeared. My hands smelled faintly of smoke, and I rubbed them against my skirt, smiling at the simplicity of it. I settled into my porch chair, the same one where I had rocked grandchildren to sleep, the same one Charles had painted for me the summer before he passed. The boards beneath my feet creaked in their familiar rhythm, a sound that steadied me. From where I sat, I could see the outline of the swing set leaning against the fence, rusted but still standing. I thought of the laughter that once rang through this yard, of small feet pounding across the grass, of voices calling my name, not out of duty, but out of joy. I closed my eyes and breathed in the evening. I was not in a sterile hallway. I was not a name on a chart or a room number. I was Margaret Cole, and I was home. This isn't rebellion, I whispered into the twilight. It's return. For the first time in a long while, I felt at peace, not because everything was resolved, not because my children had changed overnight, but because I had chosen. I had taken back the simplest, most sacred thing, the right to live on my own terms. And as the last light faded from the horizon, I knew that no matter what came next, I would never let anyone take that from me again. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these family drama and revenge stories, please subscribe and join me for more every day.